41 years ago, a 16-year-old girl from South Lyon, Michigan tried everything she could to get home. She made call after call, 5 in total, to anyone who might come pick her up. Nobody did, so she stuck out her thumb on the side of the road and disappeared into the dark of a March night in 1982. Her mother searched, detectives opened a file, and for weeks there was nothing, no witness, no clue, no trace. 25 days after she vanished, her body finally turned up. But the autopsy told investigators something that made the whole case even more disturbing. She had only been dead for 4 or 5 days, which meant that for 20 of those 25 days, while her family was pinning up flyers and praying for a phone call, she was still alive, somewhere with someone. The case froze. Decades passed, but her little sister refused to let her go. She built a Facebook page, printed flyers with her own hands, and for 15 straight years kept typing her sister's name into search engines, hoping the internet would remember what the police seemed to have forgotten. Then in 2022, a handful of college interns cracked open a dusty case box and noticed something everyone before them had missed, a name that had been sitting quietly in that file since 1983. A name that, had anyone acted on it 4 decades earlier, might have stopped a second young woman from being murdered. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let us know what city you're tuning in from tonight. And true crime stories like this one keep you up thinking. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. To understand 1982, you have to picture an America that was hurting. The country was in the grip of its worst downturn since the Great Depression. Unemployment was scraping close to 10%, and President Reagan was fielding tough questions on Capitol Hill about whether his economic plan was working at all. Factory gates were closing. Unemployment lines stretched down city blocks. Nowhere felt that pain more sharply than Michigan, where Detroit's auto plants were shedding jobs by the thousands. About 25 miles outside Detroit, tucked between the city and Ann Arbor, along Old Route 10, sat a modest town of roughly 5,000 people called South Lyon. It was the kind of place where everybody's parents worked hard and everybody's kids knew each other. In one working-class home lived Joanna, a mother raising several daughters, among them a girl named Kimberly, born on the 4th of July in 1965, and her younger sister Cindy. Kimberly loved poetry. She loved her sisters. She was, by every account, an ordinary teenage girl navigating an ordinary teenage life in a small Michigan town. On the night of March 20th, 1982, that ordinary life took a sudden turn. Kimberly was over at her boyfriend's place in Redford, a suburb west of Detroit, roughly 25 miles from home. That evening, the relationship ended, not because either of them planned it that way, it just happened. Her boyfriend had a night shift to get to, so he left, and Kimberly was alone in an empty house with no car and no ride. She made a decision that thousands of Michigan teenagers would have made without a second thought in 1982. She started walking, and she started hitchhiking. She caught a ride part way, landing near 8 Mile and Merriman Road in Livonia, closer to home, but still about 20 miles short. Around 6:30 that evening, she stopped at a gas station to use the payphone, a dime a plastic receiver, the kind of scene that used to sit on every corner in America. She called her mother first just to say she was on her way. Then she tried 4 more numbers, reaching out to anyone in South Lyon who might swing by and grab her. Every call came up empty. Nobody could come. That phone call to her mother is the last confirmed moment anyone had contact with Kimberly Louiselle while she was still free. After it, she kept doing the only thing she could think of, sticking her thumb out on 8 Mile Road, trying to close the last 20 miles home. And then, silence. No more sightings. No more calls. She was simply gone. When Kimberly didn't walk through the door that night, Joanna didn't wait long to start making calls of her own. She rang Kimberly's friends. She called around Redford and South Lyon. She reached out to the ex-boyfriend and even his co-workers on the night shift. Nobody had seen her. Nobody knew anything. The next morning, March 21st, Joanna walked into the Green Oak Township Police Department to file a missing persons report. Like so many families in that era, she ran straight into a wall of assumption. Police kept circling back to the same question. Could she be a runaway? It was the reflexive theory of the time, a teenage girl, freshly broken up with her boyfriend, out of the house overnight. Case closed in some officers' minds before it even opened. But Joanna wasn't having it. Her daughter had called. Her daughter was trying to get home. This wasn't a girl running from her family. This was a girl trying to reach them. Still, the investigation had almost nothing to work with. Nobody had seen Kimberly get into a car that night. There were no security cameras at gas stations or intersections back then. That kind of surveillance infrastructure simply didn't exist yet in small-town Michigan. No cell phone pings, no bank records, no credit card trail. She had vanished at the exact point where the paper trail of 1982 America ran out. 25 agonizing days later, on April 14, 1982, a body was discovered at Island Lake Recreation Area, a sprawling 4,000-acre state park known for fishing and hiking, with a park-and-ride lot where commuters parked their cars to catch buses into the city. Most people who passed through never wandered past the lot into the wooded trails behind it. It was the kind of spot where a body could lie undisturbed for days, remote enough to hide something, but close enough to a road that someone could slip in, leave what they needed to leave, and slip back out in minutes without anyone noticing. The park sat only about 5 miles from Kimberly's own home in South Lyon, close enough that, in some strange twist of geography, she may have ended up dying almost within sight of the town she'd spent 20 days trying to reach. But the distance from where she disappeared out on 8 Mile in Livonia to where she was found was nearly 20 miles. Whoever had taken her hadn't just grabbed her and vanished into the night. They had held on to her, moved her, and kept her somewhere for weeks before finally discarding her body. When investigators reached the scene, Kimberly's body was unclothed. Everything she'd had with her that final evening, her clothes, her purse, anything she was carrying when she left her ex-boyfriend's house was gone. None of it was ever recovered, not that year, not in the following 4 decades. To detectives, that absence spoke volumes. Someone had taken the time to strip the scene of evidence before walking away. Livingston County's medical examiner, working alongside the Michigan State Police, delivered findings that turned a devastating case into something even darker. Kimberly had been sexually assaulted, she had been beaten, she had been strangled, and that was ultimately ruled her cause of death. But it was the pattern of injuries, not just the fact of them, that told the real story. Her body carried wounds in different stages of healing, some fresh, some already scarring over. This wasn't the signature of a single violent night. This was the signature of repeated abuse, stretched out across days, even weeks, and that lined up horrifyingly well with the timeline. Kimberly disappeared on March 20th. Her body wasn't found until April 14th, 25 days later. But medical examiners estimated she'd only been dead 4 to 5 days when she was discovered, placing her actual death around April 9th or 10th. Do the math, and it means for roughly 20 days, nearly 3 full weeks, Kimberly Louiselle was alive, held somewhere by the person who had picked her up off the side of the road and subjected to sustained, repeated violence before he finally killed her. Investigators also collected biological evidence from her body, evidence that in any modern true crime story would normally be the turning point. But in 1982, that evidence was essentially frozen in time. DNA fingerprinting as an investigative tool simply didn't exist yet. British scientist Alec Jeffreys wouldn't pioneer the technique until 1984, and it wouldn't be used in an actual American criminal case until 1987 in Florida. So the sample collected from Kimberly's body went into storage at the Michigan State Police Evidence Vault, a piece of the truth locked away waiting for technology to catch up to the crime. Here's where the story takes its most painful turn. In 1983, a full year after Kimberly disappeared, someone contacted police with a tip. They pointed toward a local man, Charles David Shaw, who lived less than 5 miles from where Kimberly had vanished. The tipster described something unusual. Shaw had reportedly gutted and cleaned out his own apartment in a strange, thorough way, disposing of his belongings almost like he was erasing his own footprint. On its own, that behavior could mean any number of things. But it also fit a very specific profile, someone trying to wipe away evidence. That tip went into the file, and then nothing happened. Shaw was never brought in for questioning. Nobody asked where he was in March and April of 1982. Nobody checked his alibi, searched his apartment, or even flagged his name for future review. He wasn't cleared, and he wasn't pursued. He simply existed as a stray note in a folder, filed away and forgotten for the next 40 years. It's worth sitting with that for a second. DNA testing wasn't available in 1983, that's true. But old-fashioned police work was interviews, alibi checks, canvassing his apartment building, talking to neighbors. Any of that might have put Shaw under a spotlight he never should have escaped. And if it had, if investigators had simply followed up on the lead sitting right in front of them, a 19-year-old named Christina Castiglione might never have crossed paths with Shaw at all, because almost exactly 1 year later in March of 1983, he killed her too. That's not speculation built for drama. That's a documented, plausible chain of cause and effect that nobody in a position of authority has ever had to answer for. As the years rolled on, DNA science evolved dramatically. By the late 1980s, the FBI had begun building what would become CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database designed to link crime scene evidence to convicted offenders. By 1998, it was running nationwide, eventually holding hundreds of thousands of genetic profiles. Michigan State Police entered Kimberly's case sample into the system and ran it periodically over the years. Every single time, no match. There was a bitter irony buried in that failure. Charles Shaw actually had a criminal record: burglary in 1973, drug possession in 1977, and in 1981, the attempted abduction of a woman in a McDonald's parking lot in Fowlerville, a crime for which he served just 2 weeks in jail, followed by probation. But because he died in November of 1983, before mandatory DNA collection from offenders became standard practice, his genetic profile was never in the system to begin with. CODIS could run Kimberly's evidence against a mountain of profiles for decades, and it would never find Shaw, because Shaw was never there to be found. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the file periodically, new detectives inheriting the case, new tools promising a breakthrough, new attempts to connect it to other unsolved Michigan homicides. Each time, the trail went cold again. The case became one of those files that everyone in the department knew about but nobody could crack. While detectives cycled through the file every few years, one person never stopped thinking about Kimberly for a single day: her younger sister, Cindy. Sometime in the mid-2000s, more than 20 years after the murder, Cindy sat down at her computer and typed her sister's name into a search engine, not really expecting to find anything, but needing to know whether the world still remembered Kimberly at all. What she found was almost nothing. 2 old newspaper clippings, riddled with inaccuracies and otherwise silence. No memorial page, no digital footprint, no sign that her sister's murder had ever really registered beyond a filing cabinet in Michigan. Cindy later described the feeling bluntly. It was as if Kimberly had never existed at all. So Cindy built the record herself. She created a Facebook page dedicated entirely to her sister's case, correcting the errors from those old articles, laying out the timeline accurately, posting photos of Kimberly, and pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. She printed and distributed flyers around South Lyon and Livonia. She tracked down Kimberly's old friends, now in their 40s and 50s, hoping someone remembered even a fragment from that final week. She studied every cold case that Michigan authorities managed to solve, looking for patterns, techniques, anything that might apply to her sister's file. She had no badge, no forensic training, no legal authority to compel anyone to do anything. What she had was 15 years of refusing to let her sister become a statistic. She couldn't order a DNA test. She couldn't pull anyone's criminal record. She couldn't submit anything to CODIS herself, but she could make sure that if anyone ever went looking for Kimberly's story, they would find something, proof that a family was still out there, still asking, still waiting. And that mattered more than Cindy could have known at the time. When Michigan State Police went looking for cases to hand off to a new cold case internship program in 2022, one of the deciding factors in choosing Kimberly's file was the fact that her case still had a visible, active presence in the community. Cindy's Facebook page, updated, accurate, still drawing attention after all those years, helped tip the scales. Without her decade and a half of quiet, unpaid, unrecognized work, there's a real chance the file would have simply stayed in its box, unselected, unopened, another name lost to time. In the summer of 2022, the Michigan State Police's 1st District Cold Case Unit teamed up with Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice, launching a hands-on internship where students didn't just study cold cases in theory, they worked the real files, real evidence, real interview transcripts, real decades-old paperwork that veteran investigators had read so many times they could practically recite it from memory, and in some cases had stopped truly seeing. That's precisely the advantage the students had. They opened Kimberly's file with no history, no baggage, no prior theories clouding their read. And buried in that mountain of paperwork, they found the same 1983 note about Charles David Shaw. The suspicious apartment cleanout, the proximity to South Lyon, a name that had sat untouched, unflagged, and uninvestigated for nearly 40 years. To the students, seeing it fresh for the first time, it stood out as exactly what it was, a lead that had never been chased down. At almost the exact same moment, in a stroke of coincidence that would end up cracking the whole case wide open, a completely separate team at the Livingston County Sheriff's Office was digging into an entirely different unsolved murder, that of Christina Castiglione, the 19-year-old last seen walking near a park in Redford Township on the night of March 19, 1983. She'd been reported missing 2 days later, and her body was discovered on March 29th in a state game area in Deerfield Township. She'd been raped and strangled, a case that had gone unsolved for just as long as Kimberly's. In May of 2022, the Livingston County Cold Case Team caught a break in the form of funding, a grant from Season of Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to bankrolling advanced DNA testing for cold cases across the country. That money went towards sending Castiglione's decades-old evidence to Othram Inc., a private forensic lab based in the Woodlands, Texas, specializing in a next-generation approach to DNA analysis. Here's the difference that matters. Traditional CODIS profiling looks at around 20 specific points of variation in a DNA sample, plenty to confirm a match if you already have a suspect, but not nearly enough to identify a total stranger from scratch. Often called forensic-grade genome sequencing, examines millions of genetic markers across an entire genome, building a profile so detailed it can reconstruct family trees from evidence that's been sitting in storage, degraded and compromised for the better part of 40 years. It's the same underlying philosophy that genetic genealogists first proved could crack cold cases with a landmark case back in 2011, refined and supercharged for the 2020s. Once Othram built that detailed genetic profile from the Castiglione evidence, genealogists uploaded it into public ancestry databases, the same platforms where millions of ordinary Americans have voluntarily submitted their own DNA, hoping to find long-lost relatives. From there, distant genetic matches let investigators start constructing family trees in reverse, narrowing an impossibly large pool of potential suspects down to a small handful of related names. To make absolutely sure they had the right person, the Livingston County team ran 3 separate, independent familial DNA comparisons rather than relying on just one. All 3 converged on the exact same name, Charles David Shaw, who was 26 years old when he killed Christina Castiglione. His surviving family cooperated with investigators throughout the confirmation process. By February of 2023, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office had entered Shaw's profile into CODIS and publicly named him as their suspect in the Castiglione murder. Think about the timing here for a moment. In one building, a group of college interns had just flagged Shaw's name in a completely different 1982 murder file. In another, investigators had just confirmed, through cutting-edge genetic genealogy, that Shaw had killed a teenager in 1983. 2 separate cold cases. 2 separate investigative teams, 2 threads that neither group yet realized were tied to the exact same man. Once Shaw's DNA profile was sitting in CODIS from the Castiglione case, it automatically became searchable against every unsolved evidence sample in the national database, including evidence from cases far outside Livingston County. In June of 2023, with Shaw's name already circled in red by the MSU interns working Kimberly's file and his DNA now formally logged in the system, the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division resubmitted the decades-old evidence from Kimberly Louissel's case for comparison. The result came back unambiguous, not a partial hit, not a needs further testing flag, a full, confirmed match. The DNA recovered from Kimberly's body back in 1982 belonged to Charles David Shaw, the same man who had murdered Christina Castiglione almost exactly 1 year later. Detective Sergeant Larry Rothman of the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit made the call that Joanna Louissel had waited 41 years to receive. After 4 decades of being questioned, doubted, and second-guessed about whether her daughter had simply run away, she finally had proof of what she'd known in her gut since the night Kimberly didn't come home. Her daughter was never running from anything. She was running toward home. On September 14, 2023, Michigan State Police stood in front of cameras in Lansing and formally announced what genetic evidence had confirmed Charles David Shaw was responsible for the 1982 murder of Kimberly Louissel. But there would be no handcuffs, no courtroom, no jury verdict, because Shaw had already been dead for 40 years by the time his name was finally cleared for what it truly was. He died in November of 1983, just months after killing Castiglione, from what the Wayne County Medical Examiner ruled accidental asphyxiation tied to his own high-risk personal behavior, not illness, not violence at another's hand. In a strange, almost unbearable irony, the same impulses that drove him to kill are what ultimately ended his own life less than 2 years after Kimberly disappeared. For the Louissel family, that press conference was the closest thing to justice the system could offer. A confirmed name, a closed file, no trial because there was no one left to try. Solving Kimberly's case didn't close the book on Charles Shaw. If anything, it reopened a much bigger and darker question. Investigators found no personal connection between Shaw and either of his known victims. He didn't know Kimberly. He didn't know Christina. These appear to have been crimes of pure opportunity, a predator who struck when circumstance handed him a vulnerable stranger. That raises an unsettling possibility about a third case. Anna Marie Doragazzi, a 20-year-old woman found murdered in September of 1981, 6 months before Kimberly even disappeared, under strikingly similar circumstances, raped and strangled with no suspect ever identified. Investigators are now examining whether Shaw's DNA connects him to her murder as well. If confirmed, it would officially establish him as a serial killer with at least 3 victims across a span of roughly 2 years, from 1981 until his death in 1983. And there's no telling how much further back his violence might stretch, since his full history between the 1970s and his death has never been completely mapped. Michigan State Police are now reviewing unsolved cases across the state from 1970 through 1983, and they're asking anyone with information about Charles David Shaw's activities during that window to reach out to Detective Sergeant Larry Rothman. But even with a name, a confirmed match, and a public announcement, some questions will simply never have answers. Where did Shaw take Kimberly during those 20 days she was still alive? What house? What building? What corner of Michigan hid her while her mother searched every street she could think of? Shaw took those details to his grave in 1983, and no amount of DNA science can ever recover them. Strip away the tragedy for a moment, and Kimberly Louisel's case stands as one of the clearest real-world arguments for pairing fresh academic eyes with veteran law enforcement experience. The students who cracked open that file weren't burdened by 40 years of assumptions about where the investigation should go. They read it cold, exactly as it was, and they caught what generations of trained investigators had somehow looked past. That partnership between Michigan State University's Criminal Justice Program and the State Police Cold Case Unit has since become a permanent fixture, and organizations like Season of Justice continue funding advanced DNA work on cold cases across multiple states, using this exact case as proof of what's possible when the right resources finally meet the right evidence. If there's anything worth carrying away from this story, it's 3 things. First, if you have a missing or murdered loved one whose case has gone cold, don't let it fade from public memory. Cindy Arthurs had no training, no funding, and no official authority, just a Facebook page and 15 years of refusing to quit. That simple, sustained effort is part of the reason this case ever got picked up again. If you're in a similar position, start documenting the case publicly, reach out to nonprofits that fund cold case DNA testing, and periodically check in with your state's cold case unit about new forensic technology that might apply to old evidence sitting in storage. Second, this case is a quiet reminder about personal safety that still applies today. Even though the specific danger has changed shape, hitchhiking was simply how people got around in parts of America in the early 1980s, a normal, unremarkable choice. But it placed Kimberly in a car with a stranger, with no way out if that stranger meant her harm. We don't hitchhike much anymore. We've got rideshare apps and phones in every pocket. But the underlying principle hasn't aged a day. Tell someone where you're going, who you're with, and when you expect to be back. And third, never underestimate what nonprofit funding can accomplish inside a justice system that's chronically short on resources. Season of Justice's grant is the entire reason Castiglione's evidence ever made it to advanced genetic sequencing. And without that step, Shaw's DNA never enters CODIS, and Kimberly's case likely stays unsolved to this day. If cases like this move you, organizations like that one rely on public donations to keep funding testing for families who are still out there waiting, the way Joanna Louisel waited for 41 years. If Kimberly's story stayed with you tonight, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next case we bring to light.